Boy, do we need to be scared. Everybody needs to be scared. I have a few notes about this very complicated situation with Russia and Ukraine, and I'll be looking at them. And the first thing to worry about, of course, is nuclear war. This is an incredible situation. We haven't been faced with it for a long time. Nuclear war, the threat of thermonuclear war. I guess the last time we were faced with a really active threat was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy handled that, Khrushchev handled that. And personally, I haven't been as worried as I was back then since then. That hasn't happened since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But now we really have to be concerned. The question is how far, how fast do we counteract what Putin and Russia have done? So there are three things to talk about. Why we have to be worried, and that is, of course, Russia. And we have to be worried about the state of the United States and also the situation in Europe. So Russia, United States, and Europe, all profoundly worrying, very, very worrying. People have been saying, experts have been saying in magazines left and right, including in Foreign Affairs and in other places, that Russia's not too much to be worried about. You know, the real threat comes from China and so forth, and Russia's a second-rate power and used to be big and all that, but now it's tiny and losing people, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other factors that, again, counteract all of that. Russia is actually the most populated rather, the least popular, the most populated country in Europe. It has 145 million people. Ukraine has 45 million. Germany has about 85 million, and that's about it. Now, altogether, Western Europe's bigger than Russia, but you can't say, therefore, Russia is puny, not in the least. It also has the second biggest economy in all of Europe, measured in a certain way in terms of purchasing power, and I'm not an economist, I can't go into it, but it has a giant economy. It is not poor, and as a matter of fact, it is now exporting agricultural goods. It is not subject to famine, at least not right at the moment. It used to be a poor place, rotten farming, all that, backward techniques, but now it's got enough food that it can actually export in the agricultural sector. And on top of that, as everybody now knows, it's the main energy supplier to West Europe, the main supplier of energy to West Europe. And energy obviously is the basis of a lot of things that make civilization possible. Russia is the main supplier to Europe. On top of that, the obvious. Does Russia have nuclear weapons? Well, yes, it is our nuclear peer. Now remember, on top of this, you often hear, we must prevent and avoid nuclear war. Well, it's too late. There's already been a nuclear war. It was called World War II. And the United States made it a nuclear war twice. Not good. Well, good at the time in that it ended a war. But it is possible, that shows, to have a nuclear war, in which case we all die. Well, that takes care of number one. Do we need to be afraid of Russia? Absolutely, or at least concerned about Russia. Do we need to be afraid of Russia when Russia is Putinizing another country? Yes, obviously. Secondly, what about our own country? Personally, I'm afraid, on a different level, of course, of the current leadership in our country, which basically is a bunch of children. Just look at the press secretary, look at all the advisors to the president, look at all the other people involved in the bureaucracy. How many of them have been through World War II, even slightly? How many of them grew up in the post-war period? How many of them speak a foreign language, and so forth and so on? The answer is very, very few. To them, it's only in a textbook. Nuclear war, war between many millions of people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's more important to them, the projects of peace, because that's all they've known. And the projects of peace are great, and they're often hard to handle, but unless you grew up in the shadow of World War II or during World War II, I would submit, you have a pretty hard time understanding what it's really all about. And right now we are under the control of children in Washington, D.C., largely. I know how harsh that sounds, but that's the way it is, in my opinion. And because of that, we have a situation with regard to our leaders and our population that hardly prepares us for the situation that we're in. Our leaders are often incompetent, we know that. Doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democratic. They spend so much time arguing with each other about other things than war and peace. For instance, about how to be woke. Isn't it vital to be woke, especially if you're a member of some minority community? Isn't it really, really vital to be woke? Well, no, it's not. And maybe this kind of crisis will get us over that, although it's doubtful, because there are two other factors, two other sub-factors to go into here that make people like me, at least, afraid of the current leadership and the current situation in our country. Namely, the rotten state of our education and the incredibly rotten state of our media, both of which, unfortunately, although leaders in many senses, are leaders technocratically, but not leaders as far as the morals of the situation, the morale of the situation are concerned. What am I trying to say? American media, American schools, very, very modern, some of the best in the world, technocratically. So you can go to an American college and learn how to get a good job. That's their main function now. If you want to specialize, or not even just specialize, but major or minor in something else, it's getting harder and harder to do that. That requires 5 other shows to go into, but that's basically what is happening. That our schools are no longer educating people, and I'm talking basically about high schools and colleges. They're no longer educating people on a very, very high level to take into consideration factors about life other than getting a job, making money. In other words, that subject will come up again. As a matter of fact, most media personalities or media executives, they're the really guilty ones, are more interested in Hollywood stars and their minor league problems than they are in war, in peace, and peace. They're more interested in trivia than in anything else. Why? Because they know their audience is interested in trivia to get diverted away from real problems and real interesting questions. The audience is far more interested in being couch potato-esque and getting interested in trivia, and the media keep them there. The media in America. If you listen, on the other hand, to outlets like the BBC, you can listen to hours and hours and hours of coverage about the current crisis, for instance, without a commercial, without any stupid references to Putin's haircut. Try that watching American television. Almost impossible. It's a very sad situation. All right, so now what about the situation in Europe? That's another thing to be concerned about. This is the last thing to be concerned about. During World War II, as I've kind of hinted, we were afraid, obviously, of Hitler and the Japanese leaders, and we won, thanks to Roosevelt, thanks to Churchill and other great leaders around the world, great and excellent leaders. And then right after World War II, the United States, being huge and very, very rich and almost totally untouched by the war, the United States took over the world, took over the defense of peace and quiet. Let's put it that way. I was almost ready to say took over the defense of freedom. We were leading the free world. But what we did really was recruit a lot of unfree countries to our side and threw them in with free countries and said, we're in charge of the free world against the evil Soviet Empire, and so forth. And that worked for a long time. It was a good thing. Just as Rome kept the peace in Europe for a long time and built up a flourishing civilization until it went nuts, the United States, after World War II, had the same kind of system. The Roman system was called the Pax Romana, which means peace Roman. And the American system was called the Pax Americana. We kept the situation in the entire world pretty stable for a long time, until just about now. And one reason, and I'll only concentrate on that one reason why the system is now fragmenting and falling apart is American troops were withdrawn from Europe out of NATO, and that was a big, bad mistake. We used to have so many American troops and their families, wives, husbands, and children, that altogether, that bunch of Americans stationed in Europe was about as big as the population of the 51st state. In other words, if you'd brought those people over here and put them in one place, they would have been equal to the population of a couple of existing American states. So the 51st American state was over in Europe. Well, so what? It cost a lot of money, and they were brought back because, after all, the Cold War ended, as Obama, for instance, assured us. Let's not worry about the Russians. Not good, not good at all. So hundreds of thousands of soldiers and their families were moved out of Europe and brought back here. And as a result of that, in my opinion, Putin, as a bad guy, which he pretty much is, looked toward America, the Atlantic Ocean, West Europe, and saw in West Europe very few American soldiers and their families. Before that, we'd been able to assure the Russians, we're really here. A large part of our population, an entire state's worth, happens to live and work and get educated in Europe. So Russia, stay where you are. Well, Putin looks now west. He has been looking west. How many American soldiers and their families does he see? Probably about 1/10 of the number that used to be visible there, who used to live there. And now NATO's frantically scrambling, and our president is frantically scrambling to put more troops over there. I would contend that withdrawing them in the first place is one big factor in the war that we see now, And as a result of all of this, here are two questions. What are we going to do? That's the main question. What are we going to do about preventing situations like we're seeing now? One of them, obviously, is send American troops back. Now, the big question is, will there be a draft? Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters and kids, boy, what a question. Will there be a draft? We needn't go into that. Draft means service, means battlefields. Hopefully, it wouldn't mean a battlefield. It would mean that there could be a draft and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people could be sent back to Europe as a result to keep the peace. But it's worrying either way. Secondly, short of that, should NATO consider this? Here's a giant and last question. Do you want to rearm the strongest country in Europe? Do you want to rearm the strongest country in NATO? That would be Germany. We all know what's happened twice in the last century. Now, I lived in Germany 15 years, and I can tell you there's no chance that an Adolf Hitler could come back and say, remember me? I'm coming back. You know, we had a good time. Let's vote for me again, and everything will be fine. Absolutely not. I never met in 15 years. Not one time did I meet anyone who missed Hitler. There was tragedy left and right during World War II, and it was widespread in Germany. Just spend some time there and you'll see Nazism over. However, what would be the effect on Germany's neighbors who were attacked during World War II if we said to Germany, why don't you rearm? Of course, when I say rearm, what I mean is increase their arms. They already have an army, but it's under, for technical reasons, you could say, it's under the control of NATO, and who controls NATO? The United States. What if we said, let's give a lot of arms back and a lot of power back to the German Army, Navy, Air Force? What would be the effect on France, Denmark, Italy, et cetera, et cetera? How happy would they be about that? Well, a lot of people in Europe, France, Italy, et cetera, are very, very happy, or were very happy, that all of those American troops were over there, sitting basically, by the way, in Germany. They were very happy that our troops were there, and their families, because that was a deterrent against Russia. It also meant we don't have to rearm the Germans, not beyond a certain extent. Now, personally, I have a lot of confidence in the German nation, and I would not be totally afraid, personally, if the Germans got a lot more military power. I'd be concerned just the same, and a lot of Europeans would be frightened. And what would happen also in Russia? If you know anything about World War II, you know Germany's entrance into World War II and its entrance into Russia was dramatic and tragic. The last thing the Russians want to see is an increased power in Germany. And if we don't send our people back there, what's the alternative? And what's the effect on Russia? Questions that I can't answer today, but thank you for listening at least to the questions.